Aristos fans. This is Aaron Reed, orchestrator and co-composer for Aristos the Musical, and I'm responding today to a question from Lady Detente. Why is it called a pop rock retelling when the songs sound so classical? And I've kind of been waiting for someone to call us out about this. Every time Muse and I have to submit a description of the show, for some reason we kind of always ask ourselves, is this still an accurate description? And I think the answer is, it's a qualified yes and. I don't think it's only pop rock today. There's definitely classical elements. Even you could even make the case that there's operatic elements or even like jazz elements due to, you know, my background and my influences. But I think to give a proper answer to like what this is exactly, I have to explain a little bit of the history of the show. So the reason we started calling it a pop rock retelling was that the first couple songs that Muse presented to me back in the summer of 2019 were Who Is This Boy? And then shortly later, Slave Woman's Lament. I think Mount Pelion, which is scene 1, came shortly after that. And those scenes, those pieces, definitely, I would say that's the right way to characterize them as pop rock.
Tomorrow perhaps I will sleep past the sunrise and find that you've gone in the night.
So that's why we initially started describing it as a pop rock retelling of the Iliad.
Be by your side by and by, 'cause where you go, I will go with you.
Fast forward 3 months, our first reading of the musical, we had collected a very small pit orchestra of some amazing, talented, generous musicians who were donating their time. And we ended up with myself playing keyboard and percussion, another keyboard player, a violin player, and a flautist. And if you think about those instruments and what sorts of sounds can come out of them, most of what you do with those is going to sound classical, right? And so, like one theme in throughout what I've done musically for Aristos is that at every point in time, I've written for the instruments I have on hand. And so prior to that very first performance, I was churning out sheet music for piano, violin, flute. And yeah, I think then is when it started to almost sound more classical, because that's the type of sounds I had at my disposal. Another thing that sort of evolved as our work progressed, the music, at every point in time I tried to fit what the music was saying to the emotional tenor of the scene, so to speak. So for example, Slave Woman's Lament, like I said, very explosive, rock-like, but still with some classical elements, violins and whatever. The drums definitely make it feel pop rock.
Where's your honor? Where's your honesty? Where's your courage? Go high. If you're sure you loved him, no, we all know you lied. Where's your golden pride? Where were you when he died?
And contrast that with something like Briseis' Flight. That's I would say that's almost operatic. You have the sweeping, like slow-moving string harmonies and the ensemble acting like a full chorus as soon as Briseis stops singing. It's really a medley.
It tangles with the sunlight, and somehow I already know I would see it grow. If he had not been mine, if he had not been mine.
It's like the evolution in what Aristos has been is it's really reflective of the process. So, as I was saying, like after that first reading, then we were on schedule to do a production with a youth dance group. With our very gracious host, Hal, who's a dance instructor who allowed us to rehearse in her studio. And with that, I ended up with myself and 2 keyboard players.
Gives way to grief, gives way to grief, gives way to grief. Grief gives way to grief, gives way to grief, gives way to grief.
So then as I was creating more of the sheet music, then the challenge became, okay, so I have 2 keyboards. What are all the sounds I can make with just 3 keyboards, including my cell phone keyboard? And so I guess I started composing a little differently, again, based on the instruments I had on hand.
Make a big circle. Clockwise, Adam. Yes. Movement, freestyle. Next, let's go. Yes, good.
And then everything ground to a halt very briefly with coronavirus, and we went remote. All of a sudden we had this amazing bevy of actors, musicians, production team from all over the world. And initially we were working with live musicians who were recording themselves remotely. We had 2 flautists, a clarinet player, 2 violin players, the cellist. On top of that, what I was able to manage to do in Logic Pro. And I think at that point is when I started thinking more, it really took a classical turn when that happened, because my musicians were mostly classically experienced, and I started to think in terms of like, well, okay, I'll explain it this way. I listen to a lot of film scores in my free time. Muse is a big opera buff, so you put those 2 influences together, you get something that sounds pretty classical, right?
And he says her name and it falls like sand, every letter coarse and fine. When you rearrange the syllables, the name she bears is mine. Cleopatra! This is for to you when the war is through, Cleopatra!
A big part of like what a piece sounds like stylistically, in my opinion, is the instruments. Like you hear drums, you hear electric guitars, you hear electric bass, you think, oh, that's pop rock. You hear violins, timpani, brass instruments, that sounds classical, you know, especially woodwinds. But there's always the DNA of the other form. Let me explain with some examples. You take Slave Woman's Lament, like I've been saying, it sounds super rocky, right? Now the chord changes for that actually come from the classical tradition. The chord changes for Slave Woman's Lament I actually picked based on a form called chaconne. It's literally a lament. Sources like Bach's chaconne in D minor from his, I think, 2nd violin partita. And Muse actually showed me Dido's Lament, When I Am Laid in Earth, from Henry Purcell's opera, Dido and Aeneas, from like the late 1600s. You have those same chord changes, that wilting bass line, and that figures in the Slave Woman's Lament. So there you go, you have classical DNA in what sounds like a pop rock piece. And then on the other side of the spectrum, you look at Who Is This Boy? 2 voices, a piano, and a cello. You could say, well, that sounds very classical, right? Actually, like I said, that started out as a pop number. Like you could maybe call that a pop ballad. And actually the chords for the chorus of Who Is This Boy, that was a very intentional choice to use simple chords. Like it's a simple piece, it's a very simple message that's being conveyed, and that was not the time to be very harmonically innovative. And the four chords, or really three chords that you hear in the chorus of Who Is This Boy, are known to some in the jazz community as Chainsmokers changes. John Fassel, back in like 2018 or so, he was a student jazz pianist, pointed out that the Chainsmokers all use like the same three chords, same chord cycle in most of their songs. And the chords there are like 6, 5, 4, 5. Very common, very accessible in popular music. And by choosing such a, what seems like a passé set of chords, like I wanted to make sure that the chorus didn't lose its meaning in like a bunch of musical stuff happening underneath it. It needs to be simple, direct, accessible, but still heartfelt. So back to what I said initially, it's a yes and. Yes, it's pop rock. Yes, it's classical. You could even call it operatic, or, you know, some sprinkles of jazz in there. At every point though in the show, the music tries to serve the narrative. And if it's very heavy, weighty drama, then it does that. If it's something lighter or more nostalgic, like Mount Pelion, that theme is almost always where you go. It's almost always stated on the guitar. Gives it a very folky feel, like something you're remembering from long ago when it was just you and your friend and your guitar, or your lyre in the boys' case.
Tomorrow perhaps I will sleep past the sunrise and find that you'd gone in the night. Tie wings to my sandals, I'll drink from the sky, and I'll be by your side by and by. 'Cause where you go, I will go with you. Oh, don't you know my childhood is in your eyes?
Too early to tell him, too late to forget. I'm counting down from 20, and time holds its breath. The memories come like rainfall, the earth is crushed to sweetness, and everything is holy and turns to gold.
Is he without his shoulders?
Tangles with the sunlight, and somehow I already know I won't see him grow old. If he had not been mine, if he had not been mine, if he had not been mine, what would I have been?
Thanks for the question, appreciate it.
Would go with you.
And
He said he'd be there tomorrow, and though you came to Troy, he somehow stayed that boy, and you are the reason.
Sort of a long answer, but maybe Muse can edit some of this down to fit on Instagram.